Hello there. I'm the real life fake wizard, and horror films cause desensitization to violence. Ooh, that's a charged claim now, isn't it? But for many horror movies today, all there is gratuitous violence. There is no substance. The stories are tissue paper thin, and in moments where audiences should care about what's happening, they don't. Because they weren't given a reason to care. They were given a reason to be repulsed, and that's about it. In ages past, horror movies had to earn your fear via a filmmaker constructing a story compelling enough that you cared about the people or the circumstances on screen. Monsters were scary and allowed to be scary because their stories were equally compelling. Violence had to be earned. Modern horror today has developed a kind of dependency on one specific tool when the story doesn't cut it, and that is fidelity to real suffering. The closer the violence looks to what would actually happen to a real human body, the more the film is praised for its commitment to the genre of body horror, creating mediocre story after mediocre story, filling the silver screen with imagery that appears physiologically realistic. Your nervous system isn't able to distinguish it from the genuine article. And so that kind of thought process leads us to an obvious question, and one that we will address today. At what point do body horror films stop being artistic expression? So the concept for this discussion comes from seeing the newly released Lee Cronin's The Mummy, which premiered on April 17th, 2026. The film follows the Cannon family, whose young daughter Katie is abducted in Egypt and possessed by a demonic monster. 8 years later, Katie is discovered inside an ancient sarcophagus and sent back home to the United States. From there, the film unravels into a violent gore fest of blood, bile, and torture of, well, children, to a point that I feel very much compelled to talk about it. This movie is disgusting, and it has such a thin, hollow narrative that my theory is that the creators visualized these grotesque scenes torturing kiddos first, and then decided to write a movie around it later on. Across its 2-hour and 13-minute runtime, the audience watches this child experience copious forms of gratuitous self-harm, as well as gratuitous violence and self-harm with her siblings. The film received an R rating, got IMAX showings, and carries the full weight of a conventional marketing campaign with wide distribution. Apparently, by putting the name Lee Cronin in the title, you're supposed to know that this is going to be extremely violent. I did not. There's something to be said that nearly every film going to theaters requires the viewer to do some kind of homework before buying tickets. You know, oh, there's a new Avengers out. Yeah, but you need to see like 26 other movies before you can see this one. You won't understand what's going on. Oh, there's a new Mummy movie out. Yeah, but the guy doing it has a scene where kids forcibly eject their incisors out of their oral cavity. That's disgusting. Is there a good reason at least for that? Well, no. Now, before we properly discuss the violence and the desensitization piece of all this, I need you to understand why this Mummy movie and movies like this Mummy movie are bad. Like, they're bad movies from the get-go and do not earn or deserve to use imagery that, which we'll talk about shortly, changes brain chemistry. Lee Cronin's The Mummy is spoiled in the opening 15 minutes of the film. In just the opening alone, you will understand who the mummy is, what the mummy is, the mechanism as to how the mummy works, and the exact sequence of events for how the rest of the movie is going to proceed. This isn't the intention of the filmmaker, however. This is entirely because the story being told is so generic that it's instantly predictable, and you will predict it with 100% certainty. So, because you already know the movie beat by beat, what follows then is 2 hours of waiting for the protagonists to figure out what you figured out at the Act 1 time jump. Now, what that means is that you're about to watch this family get tortured by something you figured out 2 hours ago, rendering this movie boring. Yeah, that's the failure in storytelling. Proper storytelling requires a kind of order with concealment and then revelation. Delivery of narrative information is how a story produces emotional responses. When the narrative conflict and trajectory to overcome that conflict are revealed in the opening minutes, you've ruined any possibility of the audience experiencing things like suspense or curiosity or surprise, all emotions of which the viewer paid $18 to see in the theater. Now, because we already know what the predictable plot is going to be, you're going to be hyper aware of all the logic failures Lee Cronin throws at you. And there are many. Number 1, the film opens in Cairo, Egypt. Charlie is a TV journalist for the United States. His daughter Katie is abducted to be mummy possessed. Yet, in the same sequence, Charlie gets a phone call that he's getting this promotion and will need to relocate to New York. This plot point goes nowhere. The film makes an 8-year time jump and places Charlie and his family at a house in New Mexico. Nearly the rest of the film will take place here. Number 2, Katie is recovered from a sarcophagus that was discovered in a plane crash. 2 Egyptian men attempted to transport this sarcophagus on a twin-propeller light aircraft. The film doesn't explain why Katie was being moved, where they were going, or how these 2 men loaded a multi-ton sarcophagus onto a light aircraft. They also don't tell us how or why the plane crashed. This scene, like many that we're describing here, are plot ignition devices. They don't make any logical sense. They open up too many questions that creatives have no interest in actually answering, and they exist solely to place Katie back into America at her family home while also being possessed. The film has no interest in the mechanics of how or why. Number 3, when Charlie and Larissa are notified of their daughter's discovery, they fly back to Cairo to retrieve her. As they arrive, they discover Katie looks and acts like a living mummy. She is in a catatonic and violently self-harming state, still wrapped in all the ritual bindings the abductors wrapped her in. Let's set the scene here. Katie is in an Egyptian hospital. There are doctors and nurses all around. None of them thought it would be a good idea to read the copywriting on the mummy wrappings fused to this child's skin. That would have been a pretty big discovery if they had. Also, what is the medical treatment for Katie in this dangerous state? Well, according to these doctors, what Katie needs is time surrounded by those who love her. That is seriously the prescription to resolve Katie's ailments, to take her home and hope for the best. Okay, so the hospital here constitutes as one of the most logically impossible depictions of medical professionals in modern day. This kid is wrapped in Egyptian writing and is violently self-harming, but the response from the doctors is to send her home and not read any of the verbiage. And why is that, you might ask? Well, because the film requires the doctors to be stupid so that we can get to the horror stuff. If they did their jobs correctly, we couldn't get to all the gory stuff. Number 4, now in a movie about mummies, and it ties to both American and Egyptian culture, which are 2 places that are very far apart from each other on the map, there is zero accountability for the very real logistics of transporting mummies through the TSA system. The film does not address how a mummified, catatonic, intermittently violent patient with no valid identification is moved across international borders, many international borders. Katie has been missing for 8 years. She has no passport. She has no documentation of any kind. In 2026, transporting a person in this condition through Egyptian customs, through airport security, onto an international flight, through TSA screenings, and through United States border control would constitute an extraordinary bureaucratic and legal undertaking if it were possible at all. There is no explanation for this. We just cut from Egypt back to the family house in America. And worse, this happens twice. Yes, this happens twice in the same film. Firstly with mummified Katie in Act 1, and later with another mummified figure in the epilogue. None of it is explained, none of it makes sense. There are many more logic failures, like Katie's abductor being shot in the heart but surviving without a scratch, or how the Egyptian detective who gets to America in time for the Act 3 final battle has her throat torn out but is able to jam her fingies into the hole to allow her to speak again. But no. Instead, to round these off, we'll resolve with the funeral. After Katie murders Grandma, who in this movie is our stand-in for the Mexican grandma mystic stereotype, they hold a funeral for Grandma at their house, where Katie's possessed siblings attack the gathered mourners. Katie herself assaults Grandma's corpse in full view of many bystanders. There are guests present to see all of this. And then the scene ends and we cut to Charlie and Larissa talking together after an indeterminate amount of time. So there's no police response? There are no questions from neighbors or family or anybody here? No, there are no consequences of any kind. This film is so logically careless that it cannot support the weight of all the violent sequences that it wants you to see. So here, we find a thin, generic plot, a failed structure to display that plot, and a failure in logic for the plot to exist. And at that point, the question of why the violent imagery exists at all becomes unavoidable. Horror, as a storytelling genre, has a long history of using the human body as a place of meaning. 1986's The Fly depicts a man disintegrating over the course of an hour and a half. The imagery is revolting. Fingernails are falling off, teeth are dropping into sinks, and flesh dissolves. It's gruesome to see, and yet the film remains 40 years later as one of the most respected works in its genre because the body horror is inseparable from the story that is being told. The protagonist's physical deterioration is the externalization of a love story collapsing under the weight of a partner's irreversible transformation. The audience is willing to endure the grotesque because the grotesque carries an emotional meaning. John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982 deploys equally visceral practical effects. Heads are detaching, torsos are splitting open, limbs are mutating, but it nests all these sequences inside a thriller built on paranoia and isolation. The violence functions as evidence in a mystery that the audience is actively trying to solve. Which character has been compromised? Who is the Thing? Lee Cronin's The Mummy and countless modern-day movies like it have no similar foundation. The body horror does not function as evidence in an ongoing investigation or mystery that the audience is trying to figure out, nor is there a character relationship complex enough to give the violence any kind of emotional stakes. Instead, these types of movies exist solely to produce a physical reaction of disgust in the viewer. And worse here, if the audience thinks for too long, they'll realize there is no substance in what they're watching. So filmmakers use blaring sound effects and jump scares as a kind of a crutch, a tool of the cowards who cannot make you afraid through their stories, so they'll settle for making your nervous system flinch through sound effects. Now, Cronin has said in interviews that this Mummy film was shaped by the death of his mother, who passed away in 2023. He describes The Mummy as a response to that loss. This biographical detail has been cited in press coverage as if it validates the film's creative choices, as though the presence of real grief in the filmmaker's life transfers by proximity into the work itself. It does not. That's not how this works. Personally, I held my grandmother's hand as she died almost 2 years ago now. Grief is universal. We all carry that weight. We all have dead people. The measure of a filmmaker is whether they can take that grief and make an audience feel it through characters and investment of a story well told. If The Mummy had accomplished that, then Cronin's personal loss would be an interesting footnote in some future retrospective interview. But no, this is a trend in modern-day writing and filmmaking that's become a real problem. A creator's personal trauma that might have had some kind of inspiration to their work has become a kind of preemptive sword to legitimize the efficacy of their work, and a preemptive shield against criticism of the aforementioned work. Before audiences can evaluate a creation on its own merits, creators are there to inject some kind of biographical context. This film is about my grief. This film is about my anxiety. This film is about my relationship with my mother. And once that framing is established, people hesitate to criticize because they think they're not just criticizing a movie or a book or a story. Now they feel as if they're criticizing the death of that person's mom, or the abuse that person sustained, or the inspiration their third-grade teacher was to them, perhaps. And that brings us to a place where, and to be very clear, this is not an attack or a personal slight on Lee Cronin at all. This is a problem in all of storytelling right now. Creators have become so consumed with embedding personal pain and personal prerogative into projects that they start treating that pain as a substitute for the actual obligations of telling a story to an audience that paid you the price of admission. Grief and expression of their personal grief have become the reason many movies exist, rather than the fuel to empower well-constructed narratives. And that makes the reality of what's on the screen all the more damning here, because if the death of your mother is the emotional wellspring for this project, if that's the experience you are drawing from to make art, then is the best you could produce a film where grandma is strangled by her rosary beads and thrown from a window, and children are tortured and mutilated? We all grieve in different ways, but what you have produced is received more like another excuse for the violent imagery instead of a justification for its existence at all. The specific imagery of child violence in this film is many and varied in execution, like sequences of tearing skin from bodies or tearing one's baby teeth out, perhaps. Well, there's research now published and peer-reviewed about what watching that kind of imagery does to your brain. When you watch violence on screen, specifically where it appears to be realistic, like there's a sense of realism, it's not the same as playing a video game. Your body responds to it. Your brain registers what it's seeing as disturbing, and you react. You wince. You look away. You feel uncomfortable. That's a normal, healthy human response. It means your empathy is functioning. You recognize suffering when you see it, even if you know it's fictional. But that response degrades with exposure. Researchers have found that people who regularly consume violent media physically react less when they encounter it. They lose the ability to empathize or sympathize with it. And it doesn't take years to develop this degradation. In one study, participants watched a series of violent film clips in an order. Within a single viewing, their sympathy for the victims declined, and their reported enjoyment of the violence increased. We're not talking about months or years here. It doesn't take seeing too much to radically alter the mind. When a viewer sits in a theater and watches Lee Cronin's The Mummy, should they describe the experience as entertaining or exhilarating or a triumph of the body horror genre, that response is not evidence of some sophisticated artistic taste. More so, this is evidence that the desensitization pipeline is functioning exactly as many citations of research predicted. To see a child removing their skin from their body or impaling themselves and calling it exhilarating is troublesome to the furthest degree. Think about what all of this means, especially in the context of these body horror films. Many of them, including The Mummy here, use escalation of violence as a means to get the ball rolling. It doesn't start off with skin flaying. It has to start off with something easier like face scratching to ramp up. Well, this escalation is doing exactly what the research describes. Each scene is training you to tolerate the next one. By the third act, imagery that should be unbearable has become the baseline because your nervous system has spent 90 minutes being incrementally conditioned to accept it. We've surpassed a film containing desensitization content. Now, this is a desensitization exercise. It is doing to its audience in real time the exact thing the researchers measured in their studies. And so that brings us to a thought experiment. If a video surfaced online or on any platform from any source depicting a child forcibly smashing their head to the point of injury, or perhaps driving a metal object into an open wound on their body, or maybe it's not children, maybe it's an adult, and they're choosing to exit this plane of existence by their own hand in a bloody manner, well, that video would be removed within minutes. The platform hosting it would face regulatory scrutiny. The individuals who filmed it would face criminal investigation. The individuals who shared it would face social and potentially legal consequences. No one would describe that video as art. No one would describe it as entertaining. The universal response would likely be horror and appropriate intervention. When violence in Lee Cronin's The Mummy makes you uncomfortable, what you're responding to is a simulation of a child in pain. There's no metaphor underneath it. And as we discussed earlier, there isn't any emotional structure to give it meaning. The story is crap. The logic is crap. So all you see is the violence. You wince because your brain is processing images that closely resemble the real suffering of a real child, and your empathy cannot fully distinguish between the simulation and the thing being simulated. Is this art? For some of these sequences, if you were to put a live leak logo on it, is that now art too? If the purpose of the imagery is to make your body respond as though the suffering is real, if the entire craft of the scene is oriented toward photorealistic fidelity to what a child in agony actually looks like, then what exactly separates that from the thing it's imitating? The film's defense is that it's fictional. The child is an actress. The wounds are prosthetics. It's not real. It's based on my mom. But the viewer's neurological response does not comprehend any disclaimers like that. The research we just discussed confirms this. The brain processes the image, and empathy erodes with it. The fictionality of the source does not matter. If I were to describe the specific acts depicted in this film in plain language on this platform, this video would be taken down. Think about that for a moment. The words that describe what this film shows are more regulated than the images themselves. I cannot say what happens in The Mummy on YouTube, but Warner Brothers can project it onto a 40-foot IMAX screen and charge you $22 to watch it. So at what point does it stop being art? I think the answer has something to do with purpose. When violence serves a story that could not be told without it, or when the horror is the mechanism through which something true about the human experience is communicated, then the discomfort is the price of admission to something meaningful. You endure it because the story has earned the right to ask that of you. In their review of Lee Cronin's The Mummy, the Times Herald drew an interesting comparison to the British video nasty era of the early 1980s, a period in which films like the original Evil Dead were seized, banned, and prosecuted for content deemed morally corrosive. Those films operated on the fringes of distribution. They were duplicated on unlabeled VHS tapes and passed between private collectors. For a time, they existed outside the institutional framework of mainstream entertainment. This Mummy movie exists inside the mainline distribution framework, and a marketing campaign positioned the film as mainstream entertainment suitable for the general movie-going audience. The critical apparatus largely cooperated too. Reviews discussed the film's gore with a kind of a clinical detachment of what was actually being portrayed, and focused more on aesthetic evaluation. The critics themselves here are part of the desensitization we've discussed. The professional film critic, by virtue of occupational exposure, has a violence habituation profile that exceeds that of the general audience. Imagery that would stop a normie viewer from seeing this film because it's too morally graphic registers to the acclimated critic simply as body horror, a genre category to be evaluated on craft rather than questioned on ethics. In 1973, The Exorcist depicted a possessed child, and the film provokes national controversy, congressional hearings, and decades of ethical debates. In 2026, Lee Cronin's The Mummy depicts comparable content with substantially more graphic detail and substantially less narrative justification. But the conversation amongst critics renders down to being too much vomit. The distance between those two responses is the distance desensitization has traveled in 53 years. Each film slightly more explicit than the last, each audience slightly more acclimated, and each critical response slightly more focused on cinematic craft and less focused on any kind of consequence. The aperture of exposure has widened so gradually that no single property could be considered a problem. What are we watching? And what have we agreed to call it? Well, that has an answer that the industry prefers not to articulate. We are watching the commercialization of depicted human suffering, produced at an industrial scale, distributed through mainstream channels, and evaluated by critical establishment whose professional exposure has rendered it unable to recognize what it is evaluating. We have agreed to call it entertainment, and at that point, we have agreed to call it art. Whether it is either of those things or whether it is something else that we lack the cultural willingness to name is a question that the research answers more honestly than any kind of reviews will. Until next time, create, innovate, inspire others to do so as well, and for the love of God, cancel Disney+.